180 hours of film were shot over 18 months. Cameras followed one man across continents, into housing estates, onto farms, through official engagements, and into rooms that no camera had ever been allowed inside before. More than 120 people who knew him agreed to be interviewed about him. All of that was cut down to 2.5 hours and broadcast on a single Wednesday evening. 13 million people in Britain sat down and watched it. And the country remembers 11 words. 11 words out of 2.5 hours, out of 180 hours of tape. That is what survived. That is what went on the front pages the next morning. And it is very likely the only part of that program you can recall this evening, if you can recall any of it at all. But here is the thing that ought to bother us slightly. Those 11 words are not what the film was made for. Nobody spent 18 months and a fortune in production money to deliver one sentence about a marriage. The rest of it was the point. All of it. Every farm, every classroom, every argument about buildings and faith and young people out of work. So tonight I want to ask a question that almost nobody asks about that program. What was actually in the other 2.5 hours? What was it built to achieve? And 32 years on, can we say whether it worked? Hello and welcome. I am Richard, and this is Richard Valentin. Now, if you were with me last time, I made you a promise at the end of that episode, and I am keeping it tonight. We spent that hour inside the machinery of the 1995 Panorama broadcast and the inquiry that eventually took it apart. Several of you wrote to say the obvious follow-up was the film that came before it. You were right. So here we are. Pour yourself something warm, get comfortable, and let us take our time with this one, because it rewards patience. A word on how this episode works, because it is not the same shape as the last. This one falls under what I call Crown Watch. That means we are looking at media and power and at how the two use each other. And it means something specific about my own role. I am going to lay out two competing readings of this program, as strongly as their best advocates would put them, and then I am not going to tell you which one I hold. Not because I lack a view. Because on this particular question, I do not think my view is worth more than yours, and I would rather hand you the evidence than hand you a conclusion. What I will do is define the working terms as we go, so that the argument is a fair fight rather than a contest of vocabulary. By my reading, the interesting thing here is not whether the Prince of Wales should have answered one question. It is what an institution does when it decides, for the first time in its history, to explain itself at length and on camera. Let us set the scene. To understand why this film existed, you have to understand how bad the preceding 2 years had been. In December of 1992, the Prime Minister stood up in the House of Commons and announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales were separating. That same year, a biography by Andrew Morton had put one version of a private marriage into bookshops worldwide. And in the 18 months either side of it, 2 secretly recorded private telephone conversations found their way into newspapers, one involving each of them. I am going to leave those recordings there, because the content is not the point, and I have no interest in rehearsing it. The point is structural. By the beginning of 1994, the heir to the throne had been discussed publicly in the most intimate possible terms for 2 solid years, and he had never once been heard from directly. That is an unusual position for a public figure to be in. Everybody else in a modern scandal gets to speak. He did not, because the convention was that he did not. So the film was, at its heart, an answer to a simple institutional question. What happens if he does? It went out on the 29th of June, 1994, on ITV. It was made by Central Independent Television and presented by Jonathan Dimbleby, a broadcaster from one of the most established families in British journalism. That last detail matters more than it looks. His father had been the voice of the nation at the coronation in 1953, the man millions listened to on the day the Queen was crowned. His brother was and remains one of the most recognizable political interviewers in the country. So when this particular journalist was handed the access, the choice carried a signal of its own. This was not a hostile outsider, and it was not a courtier either. It was the establishment interviewing the establishment, in a register both sides understood. And notice which channel it went out on. Not the BBC, ITV, the commercial network. In 1994, the BBC was in the middle of its own long argument about how it covered the monarchy, and a film of this kind on the corporation would have carried a slightly different weight. Whether the choice was deliberate or simply a matter of who proposed it first, the effect was to place the most significant royal broadcast of the decade outside the national broadcaster entirely. Two terms before we go on. The first is an access documentary. That means a film made with the cooperation of its subject, where the subject grants entry to places and situations a journalist could not otherwise reach. The arrangement is a trade. The filmmaker gets material nobody else can get. The subject gets scale, seriousness, and time. The second is the peg. In television and newspapers, a peg is the reason a story runs now rather than next month. Editors need one. This film had a good one. 1994 marked 25 years since the investiture at Caernarfon Castle in 1969, when a 9-year-old boy who had been created Prince of Wales years earlier was formally invested with the title as a young man of 20. A quarter of a century in the role. That is a legitimate peg, and it served as the stated occasion for the program. Now, the obvious question. If this was a carefully managed exercise, how much control did the subject actually have? Dimbleby has consistently said he was given complete editorial freedom. He also said he had no wish to paint a glossy portrait, and no hostility toward the man either. Those are his words about his own work, and you are entitled to weigh them as such. Nobody has produced evidence contradicting them. The way I read it, the more useful question is not whether he was leaned on, but what a subject can achieve simply by choosing who to open the door for. Let me give you two numbers, because I think they say more about this film than any review ever written of it. 180 hours of footage, 2.5 hours broadcast. That is a ratio of roughly 72 to 1. For every minute you saw, 71 minutes were left on the floor. And here is my favorite detail of the whole story. When the program ended that night, the national grid recorded a surge in electricity demand of around 700 megawatts. That is the phenomenon engineers call a television pickup. 13 million people got up at the same moment and switched on kettles and lights. So we know precisely how many people watched to the end. They boiled the water to prove it. Right. So what was in it? The bulk of the film, by a distance, was work. Cameras followed him through inner-city Birmingham and into housing estates. They filmed him with young people who were out of work and with the schemes trying to get them into it. The Prince's Trust, which he had founded back in 1976 with his naval severance pay, ran through the film as a spine. So did the Duchy of Cornwall, the estate that funds the heir's household and public work. So did farming at Highgrove and elsewhere, and the organic methods he had been pushing for years while a good deal of the agricultural establishment considered him eccentric for it. Architecture was in there. He had been arguing loudly about modern British buildings since the mid-1980s, and had made a good many enemies in the profession doing it. That argument had already cost a designer a major commission, and had provoked genuine anger among architects who felt that an unelected figure was intervening in decisions that were none of his business. The film did not shy away from that, which is worth noting. And a word on the Duchy of Cornwall, since it appears throughout and almost nobody outside Britain knows what it is. The duchy is a private estate created in the 14th century, held by the eldest son of the sovereign, comprising land and property across a swathe of southern England. Its surplus funds the heir's household, staff, and official duties. It is neither the taxpayer nor the sovereign's personal money. It sits in a category of its own, which is why arguments about it are perennial, and why so few of them are conducted with much precision. The environment was in there well before it was a mainstream political subject in Britain. And more than 120 people who knew him, from childhood friends to household staff, were interviewed for the project. Then there were the arguments, and this is where the film gets genuinely interesting, because some of them have aged in ways nobody expected. He talked about faith. Specifically, about the fact that a British sovereign holds the title Defender of the Faith and serves as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and about whether that sat comfortably in a country that had become plainly multi-faith. He suggested he saw the role as defending faith in the wider sense, across traditions, rather than guarding one established church against the others. That was, in 1994, a genuinely startling thing for an heir to say out loud, and it produced a great deal of ecclesiastical spluttering at the time. He argued for a form of national service for young people. He argued that when British forces intervened abroad, the governments who benefited ought to contribute to the cost. Neither of those is a small opinion. And here we hit the constitutional problem that hangs over the whole enterprise. The convention in Britain is that the sovereign does not express political opinions in public. An heir has more latitude, but not unlimited latitude, and every opinion he voices while waiting becomes a hostage on the day he succeeds. This is sometimes called the heir's dilemma. Say nothing for 50 years, and you arrive on the throne having stood for nothing. Say something, and every word is filed away to be quoted back at you. There is one more strand running through it that people tend to forget, because it was later overtaken by everything else. He talked about the job itself, about what an heir is actually for during the decades of waiting, when he holds a title, an income, and a platform, but no constitutional function whatsoever. That is an odd position to occupy for a working lifetime. And looking at it now, it strikes me as the most honest thing in the whole 2.5 hours. A man explaining, on camera, that he has spent 25 years trying to invent a role that nobody had defined for him. That tension is, to my eye, the actual subject of the film, not the marriage. The marriage was one section. The tension between a private man with strong convictions and a public role that requires him to hold his tongue is in every single scene, which, when you think about it, is exactly what the title said it was. Let me be honest with you about the making of this episode, because I think you deserve to know the state of my own evidence. I wanted to watch the whole thing again before writing, properly, start to finish, with a notebook. That turned out to be considerably harder than it sounds. This is a film from 1994 that has never had the kind of afterlife its notoriety would suggest. The unused footage is believed to sit in storage at Windsor. What survives in general circulation is largely the famous section and a scattering of clips. So a good deal of what I have described to you comes from contemporary reviews written by people who did sit through all of it on the night and from reporting at the time. I have leaned on their eyes rather than mine, and I want that on the record. Settle back. Now we come to the part everybody knows. Somewhere inside those 2.5 hours, Jonathan Dimbleby asked whether he had been faithful and honorable in his marriage. The answer was yes, until it became irretrievably broken down, us both having tried. 11 words, and they detonated. Now, several things about that exchange deserve to be looked at properly rather than repeated as folklore. The first is that the answer contained a defense built into it. He did not simply say yes. He placed the admission after a point in time, and he stated that both parties had tried. Whether you find that persuasive is a matter for you. But it was not a bare confession. It was a confession with a boundary drawn around it, and the boundary was doing a great deal of work. The second is that he did not name anyone. He referred to a great friend and to one of a large number of friends, and he left it there. That lasted about a day. At a press conference the following morning, his private secretary, Richard Valentin, confirmed to journalists that the woman in question was Camilla Parker Bowles. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it tells you something about how these operations run. The principal declines to name her on camera, which preserves a certain dignity in the film itself. And then an official confirms it to reporters the next day, off the film, on the record, so that the story does not spend a fortnight running as speculation. Whether that was planned in advance or was a response to unmanageable pressure, I genuinely do not know, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The third point is the most contested, so let me flag it clearly. It has been reported, notably by the former Daily Telegraph editor Sir Max Hastings speaking to Channel 4, that an earlier version of the interview was recorded in which no such admission was made, and that the prince was subsequently persuaded that the matter would emerge eventually and would land more gently if it emerged in sympathetic hands. On that account, a second session was filmed at Highgrove. I am reporting that as what it is, a serious and well-placed account, publicly given. It has not been confirmed by anyone at the palace, and no documented finding supports it. Treat it accordingly, and if anybody presents it to you as established fact, they are going further than the evidence goes. What we do have is a remark from his then Deputy Private Secretary, Stephen Lamport, who said afterwards that he did not know why the question was answered. It was answered, and that was that. I would ask you to weigh that carefully rather than skim past it. Here is a senior official, present at the time, describing the single most consequential sentence of the decade as something he could not account for. That is not the language of a plan executed. It is the language of a man watching something happen slightly faster than anyone intended. From what we know, the household spent the following morning managing an outcome rather than delivering one. And we have something rather more human. In a letter written to a friend after the broadcast and later sold at auction, the prince described the experience as what people call living dangerously, and thanked her for managing to stay awake for the full 2.5 hours. I find that letter the single most revealing document in this whole story. It is the tone of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was slightly astonished at himself. Can I tell you what happens to a program when one line escapes it? The line becomes the program, not part of it, all of it. I have watched this happen to political speeches, to interviews, to entire books. Somebody spends a year building an argument, delivers it carefully, and one sentence in the middle gets lifted out, put in 72-point type, and permanently replaces the thing it came from in the public memory. Nobody involved ever plans for it, and almost nobody survives it. Hold that thought, because the next section is entirely about it. Turn now to what the press did the following morning. The headlines went where you would expect: adultery, confession, betrayal. The tabloid coverage was severe, and it fastened on two things above all others: the admission and the remarks about faith, which a number of papers treated as an attack on the Church of England. But the more interesting material is in the serious reviews, because the critics noticed something the front pages did not. Before we get to them, one term, because it governs everything that happened that morning: news value. Every editor makes a judgment about what makes a story worth running, and the criteria are remarkably consistent across the trade: novelty, conflict, prominence of the people involved, and above all, whether something has changed. A man explaining his views on farming has not changed anything, however sincerely he explains them. A man confirming on camera what had only ever been rumor has changed the record permanently. That is not laziness on the part of editors, and it is not malice. It is the machinery working exactly as designed, which is why anyone planning a long, careful film should be able to predict, with near certainty, which 30 seconds of it will be quoted. Writing in The Independent, Allison Pearson observed that the headlines had gone straight to the adultery and the broad definition of faith, while 13 million viewers would have come away with a picture of a man who was as decent as he was troubled. She thought it the most remarkable royal film ever made, on the strength of its access to his emotional life. She was not uncritical, and found the tone privileged and self-indulgent, which she noted were precisely the qualities the film was working hardest to play down in its subject. And she made a sharp observation about the interviewer, which was that by asking the big question about infidelity, he protected his own journalistic credibility while drawing attention away from a rather gentle approach everywhere else. In the Times, Matthew Paris took a different view, and I think it is worth having both. He praised the film for what he saw as a small blow struck for civilized television discourse. His argument was that the interviewer had not extracted or bludgeoned anything. Instead, there had evidently been many conversations across many months, which produced a developing exchange between two men rather than the tension and artificiality that usually generates news but rarely produces understanding. So there you have the gap, laid out by two critics on the same weekend. 13 million people watched a long, careful, sympathetic portrait of a working life. Several million more read about a marriage the next morning without watching anything at all. Two audiences, one program. Almost no overlap in what they took away. And then, in the autumn, the second half of the exercise landed. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography was published in November of 1994. 620 pages. It was serialized in the Sunday Times ahead of publication. And it went considerably further than the film had, because for the book, the author had been given access to journals, diaries, and private letters. A palace spokesman was careful to state that the interpretations drawn from that material were the author's own. Please notice what that means in practice. The film had lasted an evening. The book kept the whole subject running through the autumn in weekly installments in a national newspaper. If the aim had been to say one's piece and then let the noise subside, that is not what the schedule was designed to produce. Here is a way of thinking about the whole thing that I keep returning to. Imagine a shopkeeper who has been badly written about for 2 years. So he clears the whole window and fills it with everything he has actually made. The tools, the craftsmanship, the years of work. It takes months to arrange. Every item in it is honest, and no window he has ever built has been better. And in the bottom corner, because he is asked directly and will not lie about it, he puts a small card admitting something private and painful. Everybody who walks past reads the card. That is not a failure of the display. It is a fact about how eyes work, and the shopkeeper is the last person to notice it. Now, weigh the two cases, and I am going to put both as strongly as I can. The first case says the film was necessary and, over time, effective. The argument runs like this. 2 years of one-sided coverage had left the heir to the throne as a stranger in his own country, defined entirely by other people's accounts. That is not survivable for an institution that depends on public consent. Something had to establish him as a working figure with a life beyond a marriage, and no short interview could have carried that weight. It needed hours, and it needed access. On that reading, look at what the film contains, and then look at where those subjects sit today. Organic farming, once treated as an eccentricity, is now unremarkable. Environmental argument, then a fringe interest for an heir, is now mainstream in every party. The multi-faith point that scandalized bishops in 1994 now looks, to a great many people, simply like an accurate description of the country. The Prince's Trust went on to work with very large numbers of young people over the following decades. And on the admission itself, this case says it was unavoidable. 2 secretly recorded conversations were already public. Denial was not available to an honest man. Better to say it once, in your own words, in a sympathetic setting, than to be caught in the alternative. There is a further strand to this reading, the one its advocates consider decisive. A monarchy that never explains itself is a monarchy that can be described by anybody. In an age of continuous coverage, silence stopped being dignified and started being dangerous, because the vacuum simply filled with other people's material. On that view, somebody in that family was going to have to speak eventually. The only question was who and when, and doing it deliberately at a moment of your own choosing beats doing it under duress later. The second case says it was a serious strategic error, and nobody should mistake it for a weak one. It begins with the obvious. If you commission a 2.5-hour film about your working life and the country takes away 11 words about your marriage, the film has failed at the thing it was for. Intentions do not count. Outcomes do. Worse, this reading argues the admission did not settle the matter. It escalated it. It confirmed on the record what had previously been rumor, which meant every subsequent report could treat it as established. Camilla Parker Bowles and her husband divorced the following year. And in November of 1995, the Princess of Wales gave her own television interview. Now I want to be extremely careful here, because this is where a lot of accounts start joining dots with a very heavy pen. Reporting has consistently suggested a connection between the 1994 film and the decision to give the 1995 interview. That is a reasonable inference, widely held. But it is an inference. It is not a documented finding, and one interview does not mechanically produce another. People make their own choices for their own reasons, and I would rather hand you a reading than a certainty. The second case also makes a subtler point, and of everything on either side, it is the point I find hardest to dismiss. By speaking at that length about his convictions, the heir spent constitutional capital he could not get back. Every argument in that film became a matter of record, available to be quoted at him for the following 28 years and beyond. There is a reason his predecessors said very little. The silence was not laziness. It was a form of protection. And there is a final point this reading makes about the timing, which I think is fair. The film was pegged to 25 years in the role. An anniversary is a soft occasion. Nothing obliged him to answer a question about his marriage on a soft occasion, and a firmer household might simply have ruled the subject out of scope before a single frame was shot. Access documentaries are negotiated. Ground rules are normal. Whatever else is true, that boundary was either never set or not held. So which reading is right? I am not going to tell you, and I said at the top that I would not. What I will say is that both cases are answering slightly different questions, and that the disagreement between them is more interesting than either verdict would be. One asks whether the ideas in the film were sound and eventually vindicated. The other asks whether the film achieved what it was commissioned to achieve at the moment it went out. You can quite consistently answer yes to the first and no to the second, and I suspect a good many thoughtful people do exactly that. Before we finish, a word about where we go next. I want to stay with this idea of a family opening its doors to a camera, because one more film belongs to this story, and it is the strangest of the lot. In 1969, a documentary was made about the whole family. 30 million people watched it. It was shown a few more times, and then it was withdrawn, and it has been effectively locked away ever since. Not because it failed, because of what some people believe it succeeded in doing. That is next time, and I think it may be the most unusual episode I have made. So let me leave you with the thought this evening has left me with. Every institution that has been badly described eventually faces the same temptation. Explain yourself. Open the doors. Show the work. Let people see what you actually do all day. It feels like the obvious remedy, and it is very hard to argue against. What 1994 demonstrates is that you do not get to decide which part of your explanation the world keeps. You can control the access, the hours, the setting, and the questions you are willing to sit through. You cannot control the sentence that gets lifted out. And the sentence that gets lifted out is almost never the one you spent 18 months building toward. Whether that is a reason not to open the doors or simply a cost of doing so is precisely the question I have been circling all evening. I have my instinct about it. I am keeping it to myself. But I would very much like to hear yours, so tell me in the comments below. Was that film a necessary act of self-defense that has aged rather well, or the moment a private matter became permanent public record? I read every one of them, and on this topic I expect you will disagree with each other more than you disagree with me. Thank you for spending this time with me. It matters more than you probably realize. Take care of yourselves. Be gentle with the people around you, and I will see you next time.